Thank you, everybody, for joining us. So we are going to take a real in-depth look at Chanukah. It'd be useful to have a Chumash if you have one in front of you. Not essential, but useful. We're going to ask 3 questions about Chanukah. Now, everyone knows the basic storyline as recorded in the Gemara in Brachos 21b. The Gemara talks about the Chashmonaim, the Maccabees came into the Beis Hamikdash. They found enough oil for one day, but the rest of the oil had been contaminated. They lit it for one day, and God performed a miracle, and it burned for 8 days. Now, why did it need 8 days? Because the process of restoring the oil was complex. The oil from the menorah could only be taken from the purest, pristine oil, from the first drop of the olive. So you can imagine. Now remember, the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash was a 7-branch candelabra, and it burnt through the night. So you needed a good lot of oil, especially during the long winter nights, to burn throughout the whole night. So actually, different reasons why it would have taken 7 days to restore the oil. All the oil had been contaminated by the Greeks. The oil, it seems, had some kind of seal on it, a hechsher from the Kohen Gadol. When they got back to the Beis Hamikdash, they couldn't find any with the hechsher, with the seal, apart from this one little jug. According to one view, the reason why it took 7 days was actually the oil processing itself only took 1 day, but the people were contaminated. And to purify the people took 7 days, and then 1 day to purify the oil. According to another view, it was actually a 4-day journey to reach wherever the kosher oil supplies were kept or processed, and 4 days each way was 8 days. Now, there is one particular, I'm going to ask 3 questions on this process. Question number 1, there's a famous principle that we've come across before. It's called Maisa Ovasim Labonim. That means that that which happened to our ancestors becomes a prototype for that which happens in subsequent generations. It's true within Sefer Bereshis itself, but it's also true with Sefer Bereshis as a prototype for events later on in Jewish history. So this is a very well-known idea. But the question that Rav Hutner, who died in 1980, asks is that what is the prototype for the Chanukah story? Where's the blueprint in Sefer Bereshis for the Chanukah episode? Now, the Chanukah episode was specific in terms of different types of decrees against the Jewish people. It's known by the terrible term as a Gezeres Hashmad. Gezeres Hashmad means a decree against the religion. In contrast to Purim, which was a decree against the race, this was a decree against the religion. In other words, if we were to convert, then, in fact, we were more than welcome. If we were to Hellenize, we'd be more than welcome. This is a decree against religion. And probably those of you who've been around this Zoom before, which I think everybody now has been around for a whole year at least, if not more, will remember that every year I quote something I found in the Chambers Encyclopedia. When I was studying for law many, many years ago, about, oh my goodness, nearly 40 years ago, or thereabouts, something along those lines. So one particular Chanukah afternoon, I was in the LSE library, not particularly motivated by the essay I was supposed to write on trusts or property or something or other. So I thought I'd research Chanukah in the great library of the LSE. And I came across a quote in Chambers Encyclopedia, which I'm going to share with you almost verbatim. And it talks about the enchanting nature of Hellenist ideology and civilization. It is testimony to the magic of Greek culture, that almost all who encountered her fell under her spell, and I quote, with a partial exception of a small band of Jews. Quite remarkable. So there I was in the LSE library, finding this endorsement of the courage of the Chashmonaim. Very tempted to do a Rakida, to dance around the LSE library by myself, singing some appropriate song, Am Yisrael Chai or something. I resisted the temptation. But anyway, quite an amazing statement. So this wasn't just a military battle, this was a cultural battle as well. And the question is, where's the roots for this cultural battle? So Rav Hutner quotes a medrash that says, any suggestions, by the way, quite a few battles or encounters in Sefer Bereshis. Pick a battle or an encounter that you might think could be the roots of Chanukah. or a gezeres hashmad, the roots of a decree against the religion?
First, in creation, when it was darkness on the earth.
Okay, good point. You are quite right that the darkness is linked to the times of Greek civilization. That's true. Counterintuitively, we'll come back to that. That's not the source for a battle.
Yitzchak Avinu, when with the wells and all that.
Doing well in terms of well. Well, actually, 3 wells, hence well. That's true. That was a moment of friction, but that also isn't cited as the source. Any others? Well, you've got various different options, but the one that the Medrash brings is the encounter between Yaakov and the angel. Yaakov and the angel. The question is, why that one? Why not between Yaakov and Esav himself? Why not between Yaakov and Lavan? Why not between Avraham and the 4 kings? Plenty of battles and brachis, plenty of friction. But the one that's linked specifically to this type of decree is Yaakov wrestling with the angel. Now, so that's our question number 1. Why that one particularly? Question number 2. Somewhere in the 3rd century BCE, the Greeks had the Torah translated into Greek, known as the Septuagint. 72 scholars were chosen by Ptolemy II and placed in separate rooms, and they all came up with the same translation of the Torah. Now, you might think this was a great advance. We made the Torah accessible to more people, let them be exposed to it. The Chachamim at the time, the Torah leaders at the time, did not subscribe to that perspective. On the contrary, it says that they, in Siman, Tov Kuf Pei, which is 580 in Shulchan Aruch HaRachaim, it actually brings that this episode happened on the 8th of Teves, and a fast day was decreed. Because Yoruda Choshech L'Olam Gimel Yamim, because darkness descended into the world for 3 days. So a fast day was decreed. Amazing. What was so tragic about that? A public fast day is indicative of a potential crisis, or a crisis that happened. Well, an actual crisis, I should say, that threatens the essence of the Jewish people. What was so tragic about translating the Torah into the vernacular? Any suggestions here? I mean, these days I look around my bookshelves, plenty of translations of the Torah.
The fact that it couldn't be understood properly without the oral law.
Good. That's a very good suggestion.
And was it a translation into Greek? So it
Yes.
lost its essence.
It lost its essence. Okay, absolutely. We'll come back to that. On the right lines. That's question number 2. Question number 3, the most technical of the questions. God performs a miracle and the lights burn for 8 days. In fact, the Pnei Yeshua, 17th century commentator on the Talmud, argues that this was not really a necessary miracle, because there is a rule that if everything is contaminated, you can use contaminated material. Now, there is a debate in the Talmud, particularly in reference to Pesach, as to whether you can use that contaminated material as a reluctant dispensation. But there is a view that no, it's completely permitted. Completely permitted. So, for example, you cannot bring the Korban Pesach if you are contaminated. You have to bring the sacrificial lamb on a month later, on what's known as Pesach Sheni, Pesach 2. But that's only as an individual. If the majority of the Jewish people are contaminated, you bring the Pesach in its contaminated state. So that Rabbi Yeshua felt, Pnei Yeshua asked the question, now hang on a minute, in which case they could have used contaminated oil. Why therefore was a miracle necessary? Why did God perform a miracle to allow them to avoid using contaminated oil? God does not perform gratuitous miracles. God performs miracles to save the Jewish people. God doesn't even perform miracles to enable us to perform mitzvahs. If you can't do a mitzvah in its natural way, then you're exempt. So why over here did God perform a miracle to enable them to perform the mitzvah of lighting with non-contaminated oil? They were perfectly allowed, at least according to one view, to light with contaminated oil.
Well, I suppose because they had once they started with the non-contaminated oil, yeah, well, I suppose they started with it. Yeah, pass. I had a thought, but it's gone.
You're going to say, I started, so I'll finish.
Yeah, I guess so. It's kind of almost, I suppose, like, Moshe raising his star, the splitting of the Red Sea. We did our part, and Hashem did the
Okay,
balance.
you're not. I mean, there are. Okay, there is a view which we're going to come back to, which is not dissimilar to that. We're going to veer slightly off in a slightly different direction, but there is a view that's very similar to that. Yes, Alan.
Isn't it correct that all beginnings should be perfect?
Okay, excellent. That is what Rabbi Yosef Engel says, and that's similar lines to what Alan was saying. All beginnings should be perfect. That's his view. He was a 19th century genius and died in 1920. Was an Av based in Krakow. That's exactly what he says. We're gonna deviate slightly from that, but basing ourselves on his principle. Okay, very good. Now, those are our three questions. Question number one was the source of the Gezeres HaShmad, this decree against religion, is the fight between Yaakov and the angel. Why is that specifically the source? Question number two was, why was it a tragedy? Torah was translated into Greek. And question number three was, why was the miracle of the oil required at all? They had a lease of dispensation, if not permission, absolute permission, to use contaminated oil.
Sorry, just to clarify with the contaminated oil,
Yes.
is that if it's all contaminated, so the fact that they found one that wasn't, does that not negate that?
Good question. No, it's if the majority is contaminated.
Okay.
Certainly when it comes to Pesach, it's if the majority of people are contaminated, you can bring the Korban Pesach if majority are contaminated. With the oil, I mean, by the time there was second night, there was nothing left that wasn't contaminated. Actually, so I'm not. I would imagine with the oil, maybe let me be more careful. With Pesach, it's if the majority is contaminated. I would assume it's the same rule with the oil, but here it wasn't majority; it was all but that little jug. So from the second day, they were certainly in the zone of all contaminated. Okay. The origins of the great battle between the Greeks and the Jewish people. Rav Samson Hirsch, who we mentioned many times before, who died in 1880, the great defender of orthodoxy and Rav in Germany and prolific writer. He's got a beautiful volumes called Collected Writings. About, I think, 6 or 7 volumes. 2 volumes are on the Chagim. If you enjoy magnificent language, translated from the German, but still very beautiful language, and wonderful concepts, then it's an incredible read. And he writes that really there were 2 civilizations that stepped forward to mold the minds of men. That was Judaism and the Hellenistic culture. Now, but as we're going to see, there was a fundamental dividing line between these 2 civilizations in the way that they saw the object of molding the minds of humanity. And it begins all the way back with the earliest prophet in the Torah. So if you have a Chumash, you have an Art Scroll Chumash, which I believe is the rigueur for this particular share. And you turn to page 42. Page 42. Noach emerges from the ark. Bottom page 42, if you want the reference, it's Perek Tes, Pasuk, Chof, Aleph. Noach emerges from the ark, Pasuk Chof, sorry. And it says, Vayochel Noach ish ha'adama, and Noach, the man of earth, debased himself and planted a vineyard. He plants a vineyard, and Noach then becomes intoxicated. On Pullman number 10.
Is there a timescale for that? Because it takes a number of years, surely, for a vineyard to become mature enough to actually make.
That's a good question. I don't actually know. I don't know.
They didn't say it was good wine, they just said it was wine.
No, but the grapes are still got to grow, even if it's like the first year.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know. Good question. Don't know. Anyway, he plants the vineyard. He becomes drunk. He then basically is uncovered within the tent. He's naked in the tent. Top of page 44, his son Chom sees him. His son Chom does not do anything about it, but goes and tells his brothers. According to one view, his son actually abused him. Then, look at the next sentence. The next sentence has 5 verbs in it. We've actually mentioned this before on Parshas Noach, but now I'm going to look at it into concepts of Chanukah. Vayikach Shem vayofes is a simla, and Shem vayofes take the garment. Vayasimu al shechem shnehem, and they place it on their shoulders. Vayelchach ronis, and they walk backwards. Vayachosas erbos avim, and they cover the nakedness of their father. Ufneim acharonis, and their faces are turned away from their father. Berbos avim leroh, and they don't see the nakedness of their father. 5 verbs. They take the garment. They place it on their shoulders. They walk backwards. They cover him. They don't see their father. 4 out of 5 verbs are expressed in the Hebrew in the plural. One verb, the first one, is translated in the plural but expressed in the singular. Not vayichu, but vayikach. You see that? Even if you're not familiar with Hebrew, you can hear the difference. Vayikach, vayosimu, vayelchu, vayichasu, ro'u. All with the u at the end indicating the plural. The first one, vayikach, is in the singular. So, in fact, as we know that every unusual phrase is a hyperlink, and Rashi brings that here it teaches us that the fact that it's in the singular indicates that one of the 2 sons was more enthusiastic and anxious about this than the other. So Shem and Yefes cover their father, but one was clearly more anxious than the other. Noach awakes from his stupor. And Noach then realizes what has happened, and he articulates the first ever prophecy. And he says in sentence 27, God will bring beauty to Yefes and dwell in the tents of Shem. He curses his son Chom for his disrespectful behavior. And as I always say, I think, mind you, somehow or other, with a name like Ham in the Torah, you kind of feel he didn't get off to a great start. Now, but he gives a blessing to his 2 other sons, a prophetic blessing. God will bring beauty to Yefes, but only dwell in the tents of Shem. What is a reference to? So Yefes is the word yafeh, which means beautiful. And that Yefes became the ancestor of Greek civilization. Which in my readings in the LSE library is described as the crucible of modern civilization. Drama, politics, poetry, architecture, crucible of modern civilization. I don't claim expertise, but that's the way that it's analyzed. However, Noach said, whilst they will ennoble mankind, they will not connect mankind to spirituality. Only Shem will connect mankind to spirituality. Shem, of course, is our ancestor, hence the term Semitic, the ancestor of Abraham and Yitzchak and Yaakov and Yishmael, interestingly enough, but Semitic. So Shem is our ancestor. So God says that that Yefes will certainly expand mankind, but only Shem will connect mankind to spirituality. Now, the question I'd like to pose is there an even earlier reference to the division of cultures? So here, I'm going to go out a little bit on a limb. The very opening sentence, the beginning of Parshas Noach. Eila told us Noach, beginning of the Parsha, back on page 30. These generations of Noach is tzaddik, of he was perfect in his generation. We've discussed it many times before. Was that a compliment to Noach or not? Yeah. So Paul is correctly shaking his head or ambivalent. So. And it all depends. I always feel it's a very Jewish sentence. Not surprising because it's in the Torah. Depends how you say it. Jews are very good at intonation. You know what? No. In his generation, he was a great man. In his generation, I could also have been a great man. They were debauched, they were depraved, they were nasty. In his generation, okay, not such a big deal. Had he been in a better generation, he wouldn't have stood out. Or do you say, you know what? In his generation, he was a great man. Could you imagine what he would have been like in a greater generation than that? He would have been outstanding, even more outstanding. So what is this debate? So one of the great writers, the Madregas of Adam, says as follows. The question was Noach, we've learned this before, proactive or reactive? Was Noach simply reactive? He was so appalled by the state of the environment around him, the moral environment, the spiritual environment, that propelled him to become a greater person. Had the environment not been as depraved, he would not have been propelled to become the person he became. Or do you say no? Noach had an inner yearning in and of its own right to connect to God, to be spiritual, to be divine, to be connected. And therefore, even in his generation, he achieved that. Could you imagine how much more he would have achieved had he been in a more supportive, more spiritually elevated generation? Reactive or proactive? So here's where I'm going out on a limb and suggesting my own chiddush, my own interpretation. And maybe at times Noach exhibited both modes of operation. And in a classic parenting concept, one child picked up one mode, and one child picked up the other. Shame, Yefes, I should say, was reactive. His father was naked. We're going to do something about it, cover him over. But Shame was not reactive. He was much more proactive. He was much more disturbed, much more anxious. My father's a spiritual being. My father's a tzaddik. My father's the man who saved the world. My father's connected to Hashem. My father's a prophet. This is appalling. He was much more appalled, and therefore, as the first verb indicates, one of them, was much more determined to cover up his father's shame than the other. In the words, that's my suggestion of a connection between the two. This then develops to become two civilizations. One civilization that is motivated, both civilizations were motivated to address the nakedness of mankind, the vulgarity of mankind. But the Greek civilization couldn't do more than that. Cover up the vulgarity of mankind with drama, with poetry, with philosophy, all the remarkable things. But it didn't go beyond that. But the Jewish civilization understood that really mankind is a spiritual being. We've got to extend beyond this world to identify what mankind really is within this world, so that God can dwell in the tents of shame. And that became the battleground between the Greeks and Klal Yisrael and the Jewish people in philosophical terms. The Greeks denying that there was anything within mankind beyond mankind. Even the Greek gods were the deification of mankind. But ultimately it was limited, or limited is the right word, constrained by mankind himself. And Klal Yisrael arguing, no, that is a fragment of the truth, but not the whole truth. The whole truth is that a human being is created in the image of Hashem. The whole truth of the human being is really only defined by reference to the otherworldly. And that otherworldliness is what ought to fashion who we are and how we behave in this world itself. You with me?
Yes.
So now this translates from those very origins all the way through to the battle. Proactive or reactive. With that concept, and by the way, that's why it was such a vicious battle. It was Exeus Hashmad. It disturbed the Greeks to such a degree, this concept which challenged them to their very, very core, that you've misunderstood what mankind is. You've misrepresented what mankind is. You underestimate it. Fascinating, the Greeks did not destroy the temple because they appreciated beauty. Not like the Babylonians or the Romans, who did destroy the temple. They appreciated beauty, but they converted the temple they brought in idols into the temple. Interesting, in the laws of Chanukah, beyond the normal rule of beautifying a mitzvah, we have a specific mitzvah to buy a beautiful menorah. Buy a beautiful menorah. There's a general rule to do mitzvahs well and beautiful. There's a specific mitzvah for Chanukah. Why? Because we say we've got nothing against beauty. Of course not. We want to make things beautiful, but on the contrary, we want to show that beauty is connected to spirituality and should connect to spirituality. It's not the replacement for spirituality, it's the connection to spirituality. Now, with this, I believe we can answer all of our questions. There are really three types of potential decree against the Jewish people, God forbid. There is the Haman-style decree, which is all about the race. Nothing to do with religion. I don't care what you do. You can stand on your heads, you can jump through hoops. I hate you as a race. Haman. Excuse me. Classic racism. Then there are those who have decreed against the laws, against bris milah, against shechita, against Shabbos. And then, God forbid, there's what's called the Gezeres HaShmad. Shmad means to eradicate the religion itself. Interestingly enough, as brought down in the Gemara and the Rambam, when there's a Gezerah against religion itself, then every aspect of Judaism becomes a symbol of all of Judaism. And remarkably enough, a person has to give up their lives even for customs, even for less than customs. If it represents my identity as a Jew, then I've got to relinquish my life, God forbid, rather than relinquish my identity as a Jew. That goes to the very, very core of who we are. That defines who we are. I can't compromise on that. Now, if we think about it, there's only really one battle in the Torah, which is between this world and forces beyond our world. And that's the battle of Yaakov versus the angel. When it comes to a battle of our identity begins beyond our world. Our identity begins in the spiritual realm. When we're fighting for our identity, we're fighting for our spiritual identity. The battle that's the prototype for that is the battle between Yaakov and the angel, where he fought with negative forces that were about our spiritual identity. Does that resonate?
Definitely resonates.
Quite complicated, but does resonate.
Okay. Well, can I decomplicate it a bit? Or
I'm just coming to terms with it.
okay, because in essence, what I'm
Thinking.
saying, okay, great. In essence, what I'm saying is that our identity is fundamentally spiritual, and the forces that attacked Yaakov were negative spiritual forces. So he was grappling with the spiritual.
But I don't know if identity's only spiritual.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, it's the nurture-nature sort of thing of our identity.
I accept that. That's on. Are you suggesting more on a cultural front?
I'm just thinking, if you break down a civilization, or if you break down it comes down to the individual person and people, and it's how they were brought up, and or how, versus nature, they were born that way, and different eras, you have different
Aspects.
aspects.
Yeah. I accept that, but the core of what defines us as a people is our spiritual connection with Hashem.
Yeah.
The core of what defines us. I agree with you that may play out in different ways, in different cultures, in different times. If I'm
Yeah, exactly.
But the core of it is exactly that. The core of it is our spiritual identity.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And in fact, you've triggered something in my mind, which I wasn't going to include. Is everyone okay time-wise?
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Which I wasn't going to include, but one of the most remarkable and moving speeches, probably that I ever heard in my life, and I've heard many, many, was by Chief Rabbi Lau, the senior Chief Rabbi Lau, a Holocaust survivor, who spoke at a conference in London. I saw the video of it, and he presented a remarkable parable. He said, imagine if a plane lands at Lod Airport. At the top of the plane emerges a figure wearing a toga. And it is one of the Greek philosophers. Was that Socrates? Socrates.
Mm.
And Socrates speaks in ancient Greek. Sorry, not at Lod Airport. Sorry, Athens Airport. Athens Airport. And he speaks in ancient Greek. And the worker at the bottom, who's working on the tarmac, at the bottom of the on the runway there, can't understand what he's saying at all. Now imagine a plane that lands somewhere in Rome. And at the top of there is someone dressed in Roman attire. And he stands on the top of the stairs when he can only pronounces Vini, Vici, Vidi. Ancient Latin. And the man at the bottom of the tarmac looks up at him, totally bewildered. Who's this strange figure in fancy dress? Now imagine a plane landing at Lod Airport. And out emerges a figure also wearing some kind of robe with a flowing beard, Moshe Rabbeinu. And the man at the bottom looks up at him and says to him, Shalom Aleichem. And Moshe Rabbeinu responds, Aleichem Shalom. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, Slicha, yesh lecha tefillin? Do you have tefillin? I don't have my tefillin with me. And the man at the bottom goes, Ken, betach yesh li tefillin. Moshe says to him, what's your name? And he goes, my name is Moshe. He goes, Gam ani Moshe. Moshe from Tbilisi. Achshav ani gar ba'aretz. Now I live in Israel. So you have tefillin, you have tzitzit. So across thousands of millennia, thousands of years, they will share the same essential identity.
Absolutely.
The same core identity. In essence, they will daven the same prayers, the Shema, exactly the same. So even if they're from totally different cultures and totally different epochs, nonetheless, the core identity is our spiritual connection. And that has traveled across time and place.
Yeah.
So when we're looking at what identifies us as a Jew, I didn't do it justice the way Rabbi Lau can say it. It still rings in my ears the way he put it across so beautifully. Gam ani Moshe. Moshe from Tbilisi. Yesh lecha tefillin? Ken, betach yesh li tefillin. Yesh lecha tzitzit? Ata ochel kashrut? Betach ani ochel kashrut. Shabbat? Ken, betach Shabbat.
Amazing.
Same culture, same identity, same core values, same religion across thousands of years. And that's what unites us all as a people. But that emerges from beyond our world. That's why when Yaakov was struggling and fighting, remember it was this battle that from which he emerged that gave him the name of Israel. This very battle, because this was a battle about his identity. Esau's angel was attempting to attack his identity in different ways. We could give many explanations to what it meant, but he was attacking his identity, and the identity of the Jewish people is otherworldly. The core identity of the Jewish people belongs to a world beyond our own, even if we now bring it into this world and we dwell in the tents of shame. Nikki, does that make more sense now?
Yeah, totally.
Okay. Now, if we move forward, we can address our other two questions. The next question was, why was it a tragedy to was translated into Greek? This is brilliant. It's not my idea, it's Rabbi Yitzchak Kotner. The purpose of translating the Torah into Greek was not to bring more God into the world, but on the contrary, it was to simply demote the Torah to be an intellectual pursuit that the Greeks could live with, to expand the mind. Fascinating intellectual pursuit that they could live with, because they were all about expanding the mind. Well, the Chachamim realized, well, this was not light, this was darkness. This is going to confuse things. As Rabbi Sachs put it so beautifully, when we pray, we speak to God, but when we learn, God speaks to us. Beautifully put.
Mm.
When you open a Chumash, when you sit in a shir, when you're hearing the word of Hashem, we are now discussing God's word. We're discussing God's mind, as it were. God's thinking. That's what we're discussing now. God's thinking. We're discussing the communication of Hashem to us through the Torah. So therefore, to translate the Torah into something academic, into something, an ology of some sort, to relegate it to the library books, that was to denude the Torah of its spiritual essence. And that was a tragedy. That wasn't light, that was darkness. To use a posh word, that was the obfuscation. You impressed by my education?
Very.
Amazing.
Right? Not sure what it means, but it seems to fit in. Right? the clouding of what Torah really is. Right? That was to what's the word? To undermine what Torah really is. And that was really, really serious. That was a national tragedy. So Chazal, the Chachamim created a fast day so people realize, oh, no. The Torah is not just an intellectual pursuit. Of course, it's intellectually engaging, but that's where it begins. That's not where it ends. That's simply the means to connect with Hashem. That's what it's all about, to connect with the other world. And now we come to the final question, which was, what was the need for the miracle? And Alan, you were very close to, well, you actually articulated what Rabbi Yosef Engel says, and I'm going to be a bit creative here and go along similar lines. Even if it was true that you were allowed to use contaminated oil, and you were allowed to use it, completely allowed to, but the oil remained contaminated, it didn't purify the oil. This dispensation didn't purify the oil. Oil remained contaminated. Using contaminated oil, if you like, is covering up the nakedness. It was fixing the problem, but it wasn't aspiring, it wasn't pristine, it wasn't aspiring, it wasn't yearning beyond that. The Maccabee said, you know what, we have fought against this culture with life and limb, we can't settle for less. We simply cannot settle for less. We're going to light with pure oil and the rest is not in our hands. And Hashem says, you know what, I endorse your yearning, and I'm going to facilitate your yearning by continuing the miracle so that you're lighted with absolutely pure oil, because that's what it's all about. To aspire beyond, to aspire for the best, to aspire to connect to spirituality.
Excellent.
Outstanding.
Very good.
Yeah,
Yeah,
very,
good.
very good.
That's
you.
really, that's what Chanukah is all about, and that's why, you know, the next 8 days, you know, and we're living in a world of darkness at the moment. There's enormous darkness, and we know that we're living in a world of anti-Semitism, a world of darkness. And I feel, just to finish off, if I may, that we've got to utilize Chanukah to extend beyond ourselves. Got to push a bit beyond ourselves. You know, I'm a big, of course, Israel advocacy is really important, but in a certain way, it's reactive. We've got to be proactive as well. To be proactive is to extend ourselves spiritually, to extend beyond the darkness and to create more light. That's what's on offer spiritually in the next 8 days, to pick an area of spirituality, to extend beyond ourselves, to push ourselves a little bit beyond that, because then we're really keying into the absolute latent power and potential of Chanukah.